The blade struck clean. His head fell forward into the sawdust, severed in one motion. A faint gasp passed through the crowd, followed by silence. On the morning of January 30th, 1649, Charles I, King of England, was led through the banqueting house in Whitehall to a scaffold built outside its windows. He wore 2 shirts to prevent the cold from making him shiver. He didn't want the public to mistake it for fear. He addressed the crowd briefly, declaring himself a good man, a just man, then laid his head upon the block. At a signal, the masked executioner brought down the axe. The execution was public, deliberate, and final. His body was taken away for private burial. His severed head, still dripping, was held up to the silent crowd. Charles I was the reigning monarch of England, Scotland, and Ireland, the anointed ruler, God's chosen on earth in his own eyes. His death marked a historic break, the first time an English king was tried and executed by his own subjects. A republic would follow. The monarchy was gone, for now. He didn't begin as a tyrant, just a voice and a crowd that listened. Charles Stuart was born on November 19, 1600, at Dunfermline Palace in Fife, Scotland. He was the second son of James VI of Scotland and Anne of Denmark. His older brother, Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, was the heir apparent. Charles was physically weak and suffered from a speech impediment and rickets in childhood. Early on, he was considered unlikely to rule, but in 1612, Henry died unexpectedly of typhoid fever. At just 11 years old, Charles became the new heir to the throne, when his father inherited the English crown in 1603, becoming James I of England. Charles became the first prince in a new royal union between England and Scotland. He received a carefully managed education under royal tutors. Courtly manners, Latin, scripture, divine theory, and chivalric ideals were central to his schooling. He was reserved, devout, and formal, in stark contrast to his flamboyant father. He grew up in a world of hierarchy, ceremony, and divine right. The idea that a king was chosen by God was not debated in his presence. It was taught as fact. From his youth, authority was not earned, it was inherited. Parliament was seen not as a partner in governance, but as a temporary necessity. In 1625, at age 24, Charles became king following the death of James I. That same year, he married Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess. The match was strategic, but it immediately stirred unease among Protestant subjects. He refused to have her crowned in an Anglican ceremony, and she refused to attend Protestant services. From the beginning, religion and politics merged uneasily in his court, yet Charles presented himself as the image of refinement. He was a patron of the arts and supported major architectural and artistic projects. His court was elegant, his language deliberate, and his sense of order unwavering. To his supporters, he was the embodiment of kingship, calm, noble, and guided by sacred principle. But this early promise would later give way to violence and control. Charles's worldview was shaped early by 2 central forces: the absolutism of his father's court and the religious certainty of high Anglican doctrine. His father, James I, was a firm believer in the divine right of kings, the belief that monarchs were accountable only to God, not to their subjects or any form of parliament. James often clashed with the English Parliament and made clear in his writings, particularly in the True Law of Free Monarchies, that the king stood above the law. This doctrine was not debated in Charles's education. It was instilled. His tutors reinforced this foundation. Sir Robert Carey, and later Bishop John Williams, delivered a curriculum rooted in obedience, ritual, and royal duty. In theology, Charles was drawn to Arminianism, a strand of Anglicanism that emphasized ceremony, hierarchy, and free will, rejecting the more austere Calvinism popular with many English Puritans. These beliefs deepened under the influence of William Laud, a clergyman who would become Archbishop of Canterbury. Laud promoted strict ceremonial worship, the authority of bishops, and a sharp rejection of Puritanism. Charles supported Laud's reforms fully. Under their guidance, the Church of England began to look and feel more Catholic in structure and ritual, even as it claimed Protestant identity. Charles's private devotion matched his public policy. He attended services regularly, favored sermons that emphasized order and obedience, and kept a religious routine. But his commitment to hierarchy went beyond the church. He believed in order as a principle, socially, politically, and spiritually. Dissent, whether from Parliament or from Puritan pulpits, was not seen as debate. It was seen as rebellion. He was also deeply influenced by the culture of European monarchy. In 1623, Charles traveled to Spain incognito in an attempt to secure a marriage alliance with the Spanish Habsburgs. The mission failed, but it exposed him to the grandeur of the Spanish court, where power was centralized, religious dissent was crushed, and kings ruled without negotiation. It left an impression. Back in England, Charles became increasingly reserved and formal. He disliked confrontation, but resisted compromise. He communicated through proclamation, not persuasion. His political instincts leaned toward withdrawal and decree, rather than open discussion. These patterns, religious formality, ideological absolutism, and a preference for isolated authority, were not spontaneous. They were taught, reinforced, and never meaningfully challenged during his rise. Soon, those ideas would be put to the test, not in theory, but in power. Charles ascended the throne in March 1625, following the death of his father, James I. At just 24, he inherited not only three crowns, England, Scotland, and Ireland, but also a growing crisis in authority. Parliament was already distrustful of royal overreach. Charles's temperament and beliefs would deepen that divide. From the outset, he ruled with distance. His coronation ceremony was held without his Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria. Parliament quickly questioned his foreign alliances and the religious tone of his court. Rather than address concerns, Charles dissolved Parliament within months of his accession, the first of many such dismissals. In 1626, he removed and imprisoned several parliamentary critics. In 1627, he began levying forced loans without parliamentary approval. Opposition grew. Charles responded with tighter control, not negotiation. His actions triggered legal backlash. In 1628, Parliament presented the Petition of Right, demanding the end of arbitrary taxation and imprisonment. Charles signed it, then ignored it. By 1629, Parliament was again dissolved. This time, he ruled without it. Thus began the period known as the Personal Rule, or the 11 Years' Tyranny. From 1629 to 1640, Charles governed without Parliament. He raised revenue through archaic taxes like ship money, once meant for coastal defense but now applied inland. This caused widespread resentment. He appointed William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury and empowered him to enforce strict religious conformity. Dissenters were fined, imprisoned, or mutilated. Charles's policies extended to Scotland. In 1637, he attempted to impose the English Book of Common Prayer on the Scottish Church. It sparked riots and led to the Bishops' Wars, forcing Charles to raise an army. But without Parliament, he lacked funds. Desperate, he recalled Parliament in 1640. It refused to grant money unless he made concessions. Charles dissolved it again. The short Parliament, months later, facing Scottish invasion and internal unrest, he had no choice but to call a new one, the Long Parliament. This time, the opposition was entrenched. Key figures like John Pym pushed for constitutional limits on royal power. Charles resisted. In 1642, after a failed attempt to arrest 5 members of Parliament in the House of Commons, war became inevitable. Now in power, Charles began turning belief into law, and law into control. The breakdown between Charles and Parliament became irreversible by 1642. The ideological gap over who held ultimate authority had grown too wide. Parliament feared royal absolutism. Charles refused to yield. The result was war. In August 1642, Charles raised his standard in Nottingham, signalling the start of the English Civil War. It was not a foreign conflict, it was Englishmen against Englishmen, royalists, cavaliers supporting the king, and parliamentarians, Roundheads, fighting for constitutional reform. Charles retained the loyalty of much of the north and west, the aristocracy, and many rural regions. Parliament controlled London, the navy, and the financial centres. The first years of war were inconclusive, but Charles made two critical errors. First, his leadership remained static. He refused to delegate real authority and rejected opportunities to compromise. Second, in 1643, he sought support from Irish Catholics, a deeply unpopular move among English Protestants. Later, in 1646, he tried negotiating with the Scots, offering to impose Presbyterianism in England in exchange for military aid. The gesture was seen as political opportunism. By 1646, royalist forces were exhausted. Charles surrendered, not to Parliament, but to the Scottish army, hoping for better terms. The Scots handed him over to the English for £100,000. He was held captive, but continued to conspire, writing secret letters and stalling negotiations. In 1647, he escaped captivity briefly, but was recaptured. Parliament, increasingly dominated by Oliver Cromwell and his new model army, had lost all trust in him. In 1648, a second civil war erupted. Royalist uprisings were crushed. That same year, the army purged Parliament of moderates in Pride's Purge, leaving a radical remnant, the Rump Parliament. They moved to settle the matter permanently. For the first time in English history, a sitting monarch would be put on trial for treason, not against the people, but against the state. The trial was held in January 1649. Charles refused to recognize its legitimacy, stating that no court had authority over a monarch. He was found guilty regardless. The sentence: death by beheading. What had begun as a dispute over taxation and governance had escalated into total collapse of the old order. The monarchy, the church, and the legal hierarchy were all at stake. Charles's belief in divine right had brought the entire system to the brink. Charles was no longer just enforcing ideas. Now, those ideas were becoming systems of control. Though Charles I is often remembered for his trial and execution, the years leading up to the civil wars revealed a systematic effort to control opposition, suppress dissent, and centralize authority, often through legal and religious mechanisms. During the personal rule from 1629 to 1640, Charles governed without Parliament. In its place, he expanded the powers of existing institutions to enforce loyalty. One of the most notorious was the Court of Star Chamber. Originally a council for equity and fairness, it was repurposed by Charles as an instrument of political punishment. It bypassed standard courts, allowed for secret proceedings, and imposed harsh penalties, including heavy fines, imprisonment, and public humiliation. Religious conformity was enforced with similar aggression. Under Archbishop William Laud, the High Commission Court targeted Puritans and other nonconformists. Preachers who criticized the King or the Church of England were fined, jailed, or mutilated. Some, like William Prynne, were sentenced to branding, ear cropping, and imprisonment for publishing dissenting pamphlets. The goal was clear: to silence opposition before it could organize. Beyond punishment, Charles imposed policies that strained his subjects financially and emotionally. The most resented was ship money, a tax traditionally used in coastal regions during wartime, extended by Charles inland and in peacetime. It was seen as taxation without consent, and it caused widespread defiance. When John Hampden, a prominent landowner, refused to pay in 1637, the case went to court. Though Charles won narrowly, the damage was done. Public support eroded. Censorship increased. Printers were licensed, presses were monitored, and seditious literature was destroyed. Political gatherings were discouraged. Surveillance grew, particularly in religious communities. In Scotland, resistance to Charles's religious policies sparked the National Covenant of 1638, a pledge to uphold Presbyterianism and resist English liturgical reforms. Charles responded by attempting to suppress the movement militarily, triggering the Bishops' Wars. His use of force only hardened opposition and deepened distrust. At the heart of these systems was Charles's unwavering belief in his divine authority. He did not frame his actions as cruelty. To him, they were necessary corrections, restoring order, ensuring obedience, preserving godly rule. But to his subjects, these measures increasingly looked like tyranny. By 1640, resentment had metastasized. Ordinary citizens feared imprisonment for speaking out. Religious minorities held underground meetings. The nobility whispered about limits to royal power. His state was not yet a police state, but the foundations had been laid. The irony was stark. In trying to preserve divine kingship, Charles had sown the seeds of revolution. What he built to maintain control became evidence used against him. Even individuals close to Charles were targeted by these systems. As Charles I tightened his grip on power, his inner circle began to fracture. Friends, allies, and even family became instruments, obstacles, or threats, and he treated them accordingly. What began as centralized rule evolved into a pattern of political isolation, distrust, and calculated exclusion. His marriage to Henrietta Maria, once viewed as a strategic alliance, grew increasingly strained under pressure. The Queen was a French Catholic and an active political advisor. She encouraged Charles to remain firm against Parliament, lobbied for military support from abroad, and helped raise funds for the royalist cause. But her influence, though welcomed by Charles, alarmed Protestant courtiers and alienated moderates. As war broke out, many blamed her for pushing the king further into absolutism. Charles's most trusted religious ally, William Laud, became a symbol of repression. Laud's harsh enforcement of religious uniformity earned him many enemies. Parliament arrested him in 1640. Charles did not intervene. Laud would remain in the Tower of London until his execution in 1645. The king's closest political confidant, Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, suffered a similar fate. Strafford was a capable administrator who governed Ireland with an iron hand and was seen as Charles's enforcer. But his ruthless tactics made him deeply unpopular. In 1641, Parliament charged him with treason. Charles promised not to sign the death warrant. Then he changed his mind. Under pressure and in fear of further unrest, he authorized Strafford's execution. This act stunned observers. Charles had sacrificed his most loyal minister to appease his enemies, and gained nothing. Parliament moved further from reconciliation. Trust eroded on all sides. Even within the royalist ranks, tensions grew. Some nobles questioned the king's judgment. Others believed he was too stubborn, too reliant on foreign advisors, or too unwilling to negotiate. His refusal to compromise with moderate parliamentarians after the First Civil War, even while imprisoned, deepened suspicions that he would never accept a constitutional monarchy. By the late 1640s, Charles spoke with fewer people. Decisions were made with minimal consultation. He believed that every man around him had the capacity to betray. Often they did, but by then, he had taught them how. Signs of strain in leadership and personal stability were now evident. By the late 1640s, Charles I was a prisoner of the state. Though still referred to as the king, his authority had collapsed. He was moved between castles, first Hampton Court, then Carisbrooke on the Isle of Wight, and finally to Windsor. Surveillance was constant. Letters were intercepted. Conversations were monitored. His world grew smaller by the week. Physically, he remained composed, but signs of wear appeared. Accounts from guards and visitors described his persistent coughing, gaunt frame, and growing fatigue. His hair, once carefully styled, was left longer than usual. He walked less and read more. His diet, once ceremonial and rich, became modest. Some noted a recurring tremor in his hands. His mental state remained focused but narrowed. He continued to write, issuing declarations, recording prayers, and drafting proposals for alliances. even when there was no audience willing to accept them. One document, the King's Book, published posthumously, reflected a man who saw his suffering as martyrdom and his trial as illegitimate. But the logic remained circular. He had not erred, and those who opposed him had sinned against divine order. There were signs of spiritual intensification. Charles spent hours reading scripture and devotional texts. He requested copies of the Book of Common Prayer and passages from the Psalms. Witnesses noted long periods of silent prayer and an obsessive focus on the figure of Christ in judgment. He reportedly refused to confess guilt in any form, maintaining that his cause was righteous to the end. During his final weeks at St. James's Palace, Charles saw only a few attendants and clergy. His children were allowed to visit briefly. In a carefully recorded meeting with his youngest son, Henry, Charles reportedly warned him not to accept the crown unless offered by Parliament, lest he endanger his soul. The message was clear: obedience to God over compromise with men. Charles did not collapse physically before his execution, but the burden of defeat and isolation pressed visibly on him. He slept irregularly, his speech slowed, he spoke less to guards and more to God. But even then, there was no public display of anguish. He remained formal, restrained, not by peace, but by conviction. The king no longer ruled anything, but he continued to act as though he did, signing letters Charles R., delivering pronouncements, and arranging his final hours with the precision of a ruler preparing a court ceremony. Despite worsening health, Charles retained control over key decisions. Charles I spent his final night at St. James's Palace, under heavy guard. He rose at 5 a.m. on the 30th of January 1649, dressed with care, and read from the Bible. He refused assistance, insisting on dignity in each step of preparation. He wore 2 shirts to prevent shivering in the cold. He did not want onlookers to think he was afraid. Before leaving, he spoke with Bishop Juxon, his remaining spiritual advisor. He requested a prayer and prepared for communion. His last written note, brief and deliberate, instructed that he be buried without pomp. He was escorted through St. James's Park to the banqueting house in Whitehall, where a scaffold had been constructed. Large crowds had gathered, though soldiers held them at a distance. The execution area was draped in black cloth. A masked executioner waited with a heavy axe. Charles stepped onto the scaffold at around 2:00 p.m. He addressed the onlookers, declaring that he was the King of England, the king of a lawful government, and a Christian man. He denied treason and affirmed his innocence. He stated that he died a faithful man to God and my country. The crowd was quiet. No protests, no cheers, only watchfulness. He turned to the executioner and handed him a small coin. "I forgive you," he said. He knelt. He adjusted his cloak. Then, laying his head on the block, he gave the signal, "I am the king. My life is my own, and I die as such." The axe fell in one stroke. His head was held aloft silently. No proclamation was made. Witnesses noted the clean execution, the blood on the block, and the absolute stillness of the crowd. Charles's body was taken away and later buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. He had requested to be interred alongside his ancestors, but Parliament refused burial in Westminster Abbey. In his final days, Charles had not expressed fear, doubt, or regret, at least not publicly. His death was choreographed with the same ritual formality he had carried through his reign. He died as he lived, believing that he alone held rightful authority. Charles died on January 30th, 1649. Power was immediately contested. With the execution of Charles I, the monarchy of England was officially abolished. The House of Commons declared that the people were the original of all just power, and the House of Lords was disbanded. The institution of kingship was described as unnecessary, burdensome, and dangerous. What followed was not stability, but uncertainty. The immediate succession was impossible. Charles's son, Charles II, was living in exile, unrecognized by the new regime. Royalists were leaderless and fragmented. Some fled abroad, others were arrested, and many lay low in the face of the rising republic. England was now declared a commonwealth, a republic governed by Parliament, but heavily influenced by the new model army, the military force that had brought Charles to trial. Oliver Cromwell, its commander, emerged as the most powerful man in the country. Though no formal title was granted at first, the regicide shocked Europe. Foreign monarchs, particularly in France and Spain, refused to recognize the new government. Diplomacy stalled. Trade with royalist allies collapsed. Internally, royalist uprisings and insurrections flared in Ireland and Scotland. In the months that followed, Parliament attempted to assert control. New laws were passed. Charles's remaining supporters were purged from government. Statues were taken down. Coins bearing his image were melted. His name was removed from official prayers. But legitimacy remained fragile. The Republic had no king, but it also had no constitution. Power shifted from Parliament to the Army Council, then to Cromwell personally. The legal machinery built under Charles remained intact, but operated under new hands, still using many of the same methods of surveillance and punishment. For many citizens, daily life continued, but uncertainty spread. Merchants hesitated, clergy worried, royalist sympathizers whispered in private. No clear future had been outlined, only the removal of the old one. The king was gone, but his shadow remained. The historical record of Charles I began to evolve immediately. In the immediate aftermath of his execution, Charles I's image fractured. To his supporters, he became a martyr, a king who died for the sanctity of monarchy and the church. To his enemies, he remained a tyrant who brought war upon his own nation. By 1660, when Charles II was restored to the throne, the narrative began to shift formally. Parliament passed legislation labeling the killing of Charles I as treason. Regicides were hunted down and executed or exiled. Official records began to recast Charles not as a failed ruler, but as a martyred sovereign, and in 1662, the Church of England added the martyrdom of King Charles I to its calendar. But modern historians have offered a wide range of interpretations. Some view Charles as a man unsuited to his time, rigid in an age that required compromise. His personal piety, artistic patronage, and commitment to religious ceremony are often noted as signs of sincere belief, not malice. Yet sincerity, they argue, does not negate responsibility. Others emphasize his role in eroding parliamentary trust. Scholars point to his repeated dissolutions of parliament, imposition of taxes without consent, and creation of legal tools like the Star Chamber as direct causes of civil conflict. They describe him not as a martyr, but as a monarch who refused political reality. Psychological profiles have speculated on traits of isolation, obsession with legitimacy, and a near-total inability to recognize error. Some describe Charles as a man who viewed compromise not as weakness, but as betrayal of divine order. In more recent decades, revisionist historians have explored how religious fear, economic strain, and cultural anxiety shaped public perception of Charles. His belief in divine kingship, though extreme in hindsight, was not uncommon among European monarchs. In this view, Charles's downfall was not inevitable. It was contingent, the result of specific political failures and escalating mistrust. Each interpretation agrees on one point: Charles's reign marks a turning point in British constitutional history. His death introduced the idea that kings could be held accountable, a radical break from centuries of tradition. Modern historians continue to debate the long-term effects of Charles's rule. The execution of Charles I altered the structure of British governance permanently. While the monarchy would eventually be restored, its absolute authority never fully returned. The principle that a king could be legally tried and executed by his own people set a precedent, not only for England, but for the modern world. The years following his death demonstrated the fragility of unchecked power in attempting to centralize control religiously, politically, and legally. Charles created the conditions for systemic backlash, His refusal to share authority led to war. His belief in divine right blinded him to constitutional shifts already reshaping Europe. The institutions that emerged after his death, including the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell and eventually the constitutional monarchy, were not immediate successes, but they reflected a deeper reckoning that no individual, however sacred they may claim to be, is beyond scrutiny. Charles's legacy lives in the tensions that still define modern governance, between authority and accountability, belief and law, tradition and reform. His story is not just about downfall, but about the cost of rigidity in a changing world. Memorials to Charles remain. His image was quietly restored to coinage and art after the Restoration. The Church of England still refers to him as king and martyr in some circles, yet his reign is more often remembered not for piety or majesty, but for the collapse it triggered and the blood it cost. Today, Charles I stands as a reminder: ideological certainty without consent or compromise can become a form of violence. His death marked the end of an era, not just of divine monarchy, but of political innocence. The executioner's axe silenced a king, but it also began a conversation that has never truly ended about who holds power and why they should.